All right, Good Friday. Um, Today we start talking about post-impressionism, the second part of our course, the second half of our course, beginning, of course, much later than the second half, but that's as it is. The distinction between impressionism and post-impressionism is an uncertain one. Is rather odd, and at the level of survey level learning, introductory learning, these are two useful categories in which we can slot specific artists. And I think remember some things that are generally true of them. I think you've already found that the label impressionism is problematic in various ways. For example, the fact that um, the painters that we associate with impressionist style weren't the only ones that exhibited in the impressionist exhibitions. There were other artists that we would associate with realism or perhaps something else. Um, Now, some of those artists became, I think we can accurately say, post-impressionists in their later years. The paintings of Monet, the paintings of haystacks and cathedral facades seem to go beyond an instantaneous recording of sense impressions to exaggerate colors. They seem more decorative than naturalistic. And we're going to see that Pissarro goes through a post-impressionist phase as well. The term post-impressionism indicates something that comes after impressionism. It also suggests that the styles have something in common. And in fact, we find the broken brushwork in one form or another and the bright colors of impressionism sustained in the post-impressionist phase that would follow. So I hope that over the next couple of weeks, you acquire a more nuanced notion of what post-impressionism is, appreciate the varieties of style that are encompassed within that umbrella, under that umbrella, and can see the somewhat permeable division between impressionism and post-impressionism. Right, the first of these artists we're going to look at is Georges Seurat, and the variant of post-impressionism that he originated, which is called Neo-Impressionism. Seurat lived a short life between 1859 and 1891, only 32 years. He was born in Paris. His father was wealthy from land speculation, but lived apart from Seurat's mother, Georges Seurat himself, and his siblings, and would then visit them periodically. I can't tell you why he did that, but that's the state of Seurat's upbringing. Seurat first studied at the École Municipale de Sculpture et des Arts, the Municipal School of Sculpture and Design, which was located near his family's home in Paris. And then in 1878, he would have been 19 years of age. He enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of the Fine Arts, the government-sponsored institution of the fine arts, School of the Fine Arts. And he enrolled at the same time in the studio of Henri Lehmann, who was a successful, established painter of the time. Seurat spent only a year there, following the usual curriculum of drawing from the drawing of plaster casts, copying great master drawings, eventually drawing the alive model. He received there a grounding in academic theory and training with its classic sizing orientation. He then spent a year in military service. And upon returning to Paris in the early 1880s, he shared a studio with Armand Jean, that's the last name, and he embarked on a study of the works of Delacroix. I'm going to go to images now. we're looking on the screen at the first work that Seurat exhibited at the Salon. This happened in 1883. This is a portrait drawing of Armand Jean. I'm going to pull up that name here. You can see it down below, I hope. This dates from 1883, and it's fairly large for a portrait drawing, 2 feet in height by 1.5 feet in width, and it is made of Conte crayon on textured paper. This is a medium that I don't think was used much at all before Seurat, but Seurat really refined to a high level and used quite extensively, and others used it after him, though it's particularly associated with the art of Seurat. Conte crayon is a drawing medium made of compressed charcoal with a wax or clay base. And Conte crayons are square in their shape, square in cross-section, often used in combination with rough paper, which holds the pigment grains well. So we don't see here drawn lines, but rather little specks of color, which are more or less light and dark. And so they aggregate to form shapes. And the lines really are simply contour lines where the edges of one shape abuts a lighter shape or a darker shape. Armand Jean is shown here in the act of drawing or painting, and we see him in pure profile. The qualities here of simplicity and clarity are ones that we will see developed on a larger scale in Seurat's later work, particularly his paintings. We're looking here at Seurat's first large-scale work. This is entitled Bathers at Asnières. Asnières was a suburb of Paris located just downstream along the Seine River. There was industry there, as we can see within this painting. Notice the smokestacks in the background. Painting was begun in 1883. I'll show you the title down there at the bottom, and finished the following year in 1884. The work is 6.5 feet in height and just about 10 feet in length, oil on canvas. The painting was made following a traditional technique whereby the artist would make preparatory studies of individual figures, individual motifs within the painting, and gradually build up the larger composition, execute that on a smaller scale, and finally on the large scale that we see here. So here, for example, is a study of one of the bathers done in Conte crayon. You can see this exact same pose is visible here. You'll notice that there are strong contrasts in light and dark, simplified shapes, simplified outlines. Notice, for example, the arc of the back, the geometricized shape of the hat, the strong light and dark contrast in places. All this is repeated in the final result. Here is a preparatory compositional study where, which is executed in a somewhat impressionist style, that is in broken brushstrokes. You'll notice that they are somewhat uniform in the lower part of the painting, at least in the landscape, different in the sky. And I suppose this is how Monet might vary his brushstroke in accordance with the particular object or atmospheric effect that he was recording. And we see again here the final result. The subject is absolutely in keeping with Impressionist interest in urban leisure. We're on the outskirts of Paris, and along the Seine River, people are boating in the background. You can see sailboats and something like a canoe There are a number of bathers and people just simply sitting alongside the water. But you'll notice that the figures, well, most of them are depicted in pure profile. And this is just one instance of the formal order that is imposed on this scene, where we would expect to find lively, noisy activity imposed on the scene by the artist. So, for example, we have here a figure in profile, here another in the distance, and then reclining figures. Now, this figure does seem to angle back into space a little bit, although that the the diagonal orientation of his position is obscured by the elimination of wrinkles in the fabric details that would indicate that recession more clearly. This figure also is turned a bit in space. Besides this alignment here, the vertical alignment of figures, which suggests depth in space, both of the overlapping but the decreasing size of the figures, we have in another line over here, which links boat with three figures, as well as the hat and the dog near them. So there are very clearly articulated compositional lines that run through the painting vertically, horizontally in the background, diagonally here in the bank, which is opposed, which is intersected by the diagonal line running in this direction. The formal clarity and formal order brought to this painting is apparent also in the modeling and or lack of modeling, as I mentioned earlier, and in the coloring of the figures. Notice the value contrast, for example. So this figure here, where the one side of his body is highlit, that is here on the right-hand side, it intersects, or it meets, it abuts water, which is darkened. And so we have a fairly strong value contrast. Now, as his body then turns and becomes shaded on the other side, it abuts the water, which is lightened in order to emphasize the contrast and to clarify one shape against another. And you'll see that goes on throughout the painting. The clothing over here shows us value contrasts that are pushed to extremes. The dark pants against the light shirt, the dark hat band against the light colored hat. This hat is tipped up on its side so that it appears as a series of concentric circles. And as I mentioned earlier, the bodies of the figures are simplified. The details that we might see in their skin, in their well, these are largely eliminated to make of the figures simple geometricized volumes. So Seurat has taken here a subject that is very much in keeping with the interests of Impressionist artists, but he has imposed on it a greater degree of abstraction, developed it utilizing a systematic approach, and achieved a kind of monumental image, an image on a grander scale than was typical of Impressionism, that has qualities of stillness and calm and in an emphatic formal order. This image was exhibited at the first Salon of the Independents, which took place in 1884. Let me say a little bit about that alternative salon, alternative exhibition venue. The Société des Artistes Indépendants, the Society of Independent Artists, was formed in 1884, and its organizers included Seurat and his follower Signac, also Gauguin, Pissarro, and Redon, among other artists. They organized with the purpose of staging alternative exhibitions. Their slogan was "without jury or reward." So there would be no selection jury, much like the Impressionist exhibitions. It was open to members to participate. This organization was authorized by the Ministry of the Fine Arts, and a site for their exhibitions was provided by the city of Paris. So it had formal administrative sanctioning in a way that the Impressionist exhibitions did not. They were entirely private. The first exhibition took place in 1884 and included Bathers at Esnier, along with 5,000 works by 400 artists in total. So this is a significant alternative to the Salon in the size of the exhibition and the number of artists that were included. The same year, 1884, Seurat began his masterwork, the work that we most know him by, which we see here, and that is Sunday on the Island of La Grande Jatte, painted between 1884 and 1886. Made of oil on canvas, and the work is 6.5 feet in height by just about 10 feet in length. So its size is really identical to Bathers at Esnier. All right, the subject is essentially the same. La Grande Jatte was an island in the Seine River. There was a park located there which drew Parisians on good days, particularly on Sunday when almost nobody worked. And they did there the very things that we see scattered across this image. There is boating going on and probably swimming, although I don't clearly see a swimmer. A lot of strolling under parasols, people clustering in groups. There are a few pets scattered about, including here a monkey, a small dog, and a larger dog. This may be a young girl out for a walk with her nanny, if not mother. Here is someone playing an musical instrument. But these things are, again, depicted in a way that imbues them with a sense of calm and order, and even in somberness that is very, very much foreign to the Impressionist treatment of such a painting, such a subject. Seurat drew on a number of influences, and let me show you some of these. Most of them are mentioned in your textbook. One of the things that he was most enthusiastic about were the murals of Puvis de Chavannes. And we see an example here. This is the same one that appears in your textbook called The Sacred Wood, which is painted between 1884 and 1889, 3 feet by about 7 feet in length. And it shows us a kind of idyllic group of people from ancient times, let's say generally, clad in togas, scattered about. There is an architectural fragment here whose columns repeat those of the trees to the right-hand side. It's said that the Greeks first worshipped in the woods, and the temples then were a kind of architectural abstraction of the woods. Children are present, as you can see. Music is referenced by the lyre, played by the figure who floats overhead. The figures are calm and somber, and they gather together in small groups. Here, a detail. Puvis was very active as a painter of murals in city halls across France. And this image, in fact, has a fresco, mural-like quality to it in its coloring and its arrangement of figures in space. He was also enthusiastic about Greek friezes, such as this. Now, we're looking at the Pan-Athenaic procession. This was a sculptural component of the Parthenon in Athens, and you're seeing it as it is displayed now in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. A detail here shows us elders and maidens. The frieze wraps around the building in its entirety, and we're seeing at the point where figures coming from two different directions meet above the entrance into the naos, or sanctuary of the temple. And you'll notice that the figures are spaced out in a kind of processional ritual fashion. They are, if they move at all, it's very slowly. Um, their draperies hang like column flutes. So there is a kind of a quietness and calm to this arrangement that is much like that we saw in the Puvis painting. And then another influence on Seurat was Egyptian tomb painting, where we see uh, rhythmic arrangements of figures that share similar poses. In this case, the standard combination of profile and frontal poses that was characteristic of Egyptian art. As usual, Seurat developed La Grande Jatte in a methodical, step-by-step, traditional fashion. The final painting is based on lots of studies of individual figures, compositional studies. We're looking here at one of the final compositional studies where essentially all the ingredients are intact, although the technique is not as labored or methodical as he would employ in the final result. Um, I want to point out here, this is something you won't see in the final result, at least not in the slide I have of it, because that omits the painted border. Seurat has supplied a painted border, and in the final result, the colors of the border, you can see that happening right down here. They shift so as to create contrast with what's in the image adjacent to that part of the border. Let's look at the final result. As we saw in Bathers at Asnières, and I think it's more pronounced here, what we would assume to be a noisy, rather chaotic, active, certainly active, dynamic scene full of movement and sound, here seems static and calm, maybe even disturbingly so. The figures are for the most part seen in profile, and we can just tick them off, here, 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 all the way across the foreground. These figures are seen frontally, and there are just a few obvious instances, like right here, the little girl who's really the only figure in active movement, along with the dog down below. They form a bit of contrast, which, if anything, emphasizes the static quality of the other figures. Even the dog, even the monkey over here with its tail, you can see, is rendered in a spiral curve that imparts a kind of rigid geometry to those figures, to that figure, and we see that elsewhere. Notice the dress of the child's escort, which is rendered as almost as a pure cylinder. The trunks of the trees appear that way. The woman here in the foreground, who has a prominent bustle as a part of her attire, her dress also takes on a cylindrical quality. Shapes have been simplified, abstracted. Contrasts have been exaggerated. We see that here between the colors. In a place like this, the orange next to the blue, these are complementary contrasts, light values against dark values. Seurat's color, this is the best place to talk about it, was strongly influenced by color theorists, two in particular by the name of Ogden Root, who wrote a book called Modern Chromatics. This was published in France in 1881. He was also influenced by the writings of Michel Eugène Chevreul, whose theoretical ideas on color had been disseminated by Charles Blanc, particularly in a in a handbook that Blanc wrote, a kind of a instructional book called The Art of Design. Seurat's ideas on color were labeled by him chromolumerism. Chromolumerism. So chroma refers to color and lumerism to the brightness of color. Seurat sought to enhance the luminosity of colors by divisionism, that is, by dividing a color up into its component hues. And what he would do then is to place various tints or variations on a color over an underlying local color, as well as including contrasting hues. I've got a detail here which allows us to see that around the head of this figure, placed in profile, we've got what is green grass. And notice that there's an underlying color, which is a kind of a pale yellow green. And on top of that, then, are placed darker tints, is the term that would be used here, orangish and green. Within the girl's head, well, her hair is a kind of brown orange color, and we see some variations of that. But we also see the complementary color. The complementary of orange is blue. There's a good bit of blue here, a good bit of blue in the face as a complementary to the orangish, pinkish tones of the face. So that we see that in any one color area actually consists of a number of hues and values, and they are not mixed together but kept apart, with the assumption on the part of the painter that the viewer seeing these things, seeing the painting from a distance, the viewer's eyes would mix these various hues and values together. Optical mixture would be the result. And this accords with Chevreul's idea of color harmony, which might be achieved, he said, by juxtaposing analogous colors or by balancing complementaries. The technique then of application that Seurat chose to use renders these various hues and values as little dots, almost uniform dots. That's particularly visible over here. And so it's no surprise that, let's go back, it's no surprise that the painting took a long time to develop and to execute. And we see here a kind of a generalized rendition of the various colors that make up specific areas, and then following this, a more systematic rendition in this final version, where the dot is used in a technique that is generally known as pointillism. Back to its subject, the painting mixes together different social classes. So we see here a worker who is attired in a sleeveless shirt and a cap, and behind him, very close to him, is a bourgeois couple. Here are well-dressed people. The woman, it's often said, might be a paramour, might be a lover, the mistress of the male figure behind her. It's striking that these figures occupy the same space. And so what's suggested here is social harmony. And it might be said that the social harmony that is figured in the people present and in their clothing is then expressed symbolically in the color technique, which breaks a general color down into its constituent hues and places them close together, relying on the optical mixture of the viewer. So this work was exhibited at the 8th Impressionist exhibition in 1886. It was much discussed, and you can see here in this view that I flashed on earlier, this is what it looks like today in the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a big painting. It has a monumental presence. And there's a kind of grandeur in the way that this modern subject is presented, with the figures very carefully arranged in a way that conveys those ideas of a kind of universal a calmness, an order that has universal implications. It was at this time, at this exhibition then, that the critic Félix Fénéon labeled Seurat a neo-impressionist. That term was then much used in the years that followed. Seurat also painted during these years landscapes. I want to show you a few. This is one called Port en Bézin at high tide. It dates from 1888. You'll see in all these landscapes that they're virtually devoid of activity. The fact that boats are out here suggests that something is happening. There is movement within the scene, though it's of course it's still, it's frozen in the painting. There are presumably people on the boat, but you'll see no people walking about, no work being done. And this is typical of Seurat's landscapes. Here is a work entitled The Luzerne at Saint-Denis from 1885. In every case, we've got the landscape simplified, abstracted into clear color zones, and in this case, flattened. It's really only the distant buildings and the tree in the middle ground, the buildings in the far distance, that give us a clear sense of space unfolding over a course of, over the space of, over a distance of some magnitude. And here, one other landscape, this one entitled Evening en Fleur, which dates from 1886. If we compare this to a landscape by Monet of really the same location, that is along the coast of Normandy, along the English Channel, you're looking on the right-hand side at Monet's painting of the boardwalk at Trouville from 1870. So only about 15 years separates the painting. But what a schism in artistic style. Monet's work is a classic example of Impressionism. That is a lively scene of outdoor leisure along the coast. People are scattered about. Certainly movement is implied by their activity of walking, strolling, and the depiction of the clouds in the sky. The waves perhaps as well. The technique is a more spontaneous, instinctive one, with the pigment laid on in brushstrokes of varying shape and size. In contrast, Seurat eliminates people. This is probably a studio painting based on some observations made out of doors. But what we see is a series of horizontal lines in the horizon, and the pier in the distance, the clouds. That is a rhythmic arrangement of those features in the landscape. And in the foreground, the repeated diagonal lines that form a contrasting rhythm of the shoreline and these wooden structures. The paint applied in uniform pointillist dots. Now you notice in two of the paintings that I've shown you that the Seurat painted the frame as well, supplied a frame which forms, I think, an effective contrast with the content of the painting. It shares some of the same colors, but it's dark and compared with the generally lighter content within the painting. This may come from an awareness of a development in music. Seurat was much interested in what was going on in the other arts at the time. In a obituary article on Seurat written in 1891, so just a few years after this was painted, the critic Gustave Kahn noted that Seurat, quote, spoke in a very literary and articulate fashion, seeking to compare the progress of his art with the evolution of the arts of sound. Very preoccupied with finding a unity at the heart of his efforts and those of poets and musicians. He was aware of the music dramas of Wagner and the various innovations that they included. One of which was that, unlike French opera at the time, the lights in the house, in the auditorium, were not left on so that you could see what was going on in the hall, who else was there. They were turned off, and the only light was that on the stage, so that the stage had a kind of luminous presence surrounded by the darkness of the theater. And so it's thought that Seurat was referencing and responding to that presentation of operatic activity in his enclosing of the painted scene in a darkened frame. I want to show you a couple other works done in Conte crayon. This is, and both of these are cafe concert scenes. This is called European concert is the way it's labeled. And this dates from, do I have a date here? 1887 is the date on this. Notice again that there are no lines to speak of, but just little touches. The technique is sort of the drawn counterpart of Seurat's pointillism, with little touches of light and dark that give us the idea of an audience, observers here in the foreground, seen largely as silhouettes against the performer, seen in frontal pose on the stage in the background. And here another version, another similar work, the Eden concert by Seurat, dating from 1886-87. In many ways, this is similar to the works of Degas, with the silhouetted bass violin in the foreground and a bit of the performer, fragmented, seen against the luminous stage. Much is made of the lights, as Degas did as well. Above the stage, beyond the stage, they appear as highly abstracted shapes against their darkened surroundings. And we see a single performer with the bustle as a part of her attire, depicted in profile. One of the last paintings by Seurat I'm going to show you takes up the same subject, that is cafe concert scenes. And this work is entitled La Chahut. It dates from 1889 and 1890. Now, at the last Impressionist exhibition, Seurat met a man by the name of Charles Henry, Charles Henry, who lived between 1859, born the same year as Seurat, and died in 1926. That happens to be the same year as Monet's death. Henry was a French librarian, mathematician, and editor. An intellectual, broadly interested in a range of things. He was a friend of the symbolist writers, Félix Fénéon and also Gustave Kahn, both wrote about art. And from Henri, Seurat adopted concepts of emotional associational theory to painting. Henri had published these in a treatise which was called A Scientific Aesthetic, published in 1885. And there he asserted that the visual elements of line and shape and color, they have an abstract value in eliciting responses from us, independent of whatever they might be used to represent. He believed that warm colors, such as reds and yellows and oranges, as well as upward-oriented lines and shapes, they gave pleasure, they convey feelings of joy and energy. And he labeled these dynamogenous forms. Cool colors, in contrast, and downward lines and shapes arouse feelings of discomfort, sadness, and gloom in the viewer. And he called these inhibitory elements and inhibitory visual elements. Uh, so that a painter might then coordinate these forms with a chosen subject, whether that's a festive one or a melancholy one, um, as appropriate, and give a painting an objective scientific basis. Well, these ideas appealed very much to Seurat, who had already drawn on the ideas of color theorists, Chevreul and Root. And so in this painting, which is called La Chahut, we see him applying the ideas of Henri. The painting dates from 1889, 1890, as I said. It is 66 by 55 inches. It was exhibited at the Salon of the Independents in 1890. So the Café Concert subject shows us, again, a silhouetted performer on bass violin in the foreground. We also see, as Degas might fragment an instrumentalist, the hands and just a portion of the instrument of a flute. Here is the conductor, also fragmented in the lower left-hand corner, and a single male viewer who seems to be leering at the revelation of skirts and perhaps scantily clad limbs of the figures. The title Chahut was a kind of can-can, a variation on the can-can, with its high stepping motion that included male figures as well. So notice we see an alternation of female and male figures dancing on stage. Well, you notice that throughout the painting, there are upward reaching shapes. And we see this in the smallest details, such as the bows on the shoes of the performers. You would think those might be hanging downward at this moment, but they too, like the legs of the performers, are projected upward. Notice the bows on the upward reaching shoes do the same thing. These are presumably gas lamps that illuminate the space, but they're rendered here as abstracted polygons that open upward, just as the flowers do on the wall to the left. The coloring is, for the most part, warm, reddish hues, yellowish hues, although with some contrast in the blues that we see in the more shadowy parts of the image. There was this notion in avant-garde theory at the time, which Seurat was enthusiastic about, Seurat was interested in, that music gave access to a higher level of existence, a higher plane of existence. And that by experiencing music, one might enter a kind of exalted state. Perhaps in a vulgar way, at least, we see the single observer here. I guess there are just the vague hints of other observers around the stage in the background. One other late painting by Seurat, with a musical subject as well, is this, which is called La Parade. And this dates from 1887 to 88. The painting is about 5 feet in length. This was exhibited at the Salon of the Independents in 1888. And what we're seeing here is a kind of sideshow, a kind of advertisement sideshow for a circus. And it includes musicians who are rhythmically spaced in the background. They're playing trombones and cornets. We see a single figure here on a stage who has a kind of a priest-like presence, isolated as he is, looking frontally at us in a kind of hieratic pose. There are observers silhouetted down below, and then there is a ticket taker over here in a kind of a cage-like window. You'll notice that here too, There are lamps whose illumination is shown in a kind of abstracted form which opens upward. Um, so here too, we may have a painting that thematizes music as providing access to a higher level of existence, which is ignored by most of the people down below who engage in conversation with one another and pay little attention to what's going on. In the art of Seurat, then, in conclusion, we see a revival of some aspects of traditional art. That is, in the pursuit of many preparatory studies, the building up of a final painting. This is so different from the more spontaneous technique of the Impressionists. In the interest in order and clarity, clear contrast. Seurat is perpetuating the modern subject matter and the bright color of Impressionism, but bringing to it a new kind of monumentality and an attempt to join art to novel scientific theories. Seurat's art was highly influential, most especially on the painter Paul Signac, who was born in 1863 and lived until 1935. So he outlived Seurat by over 40 years. He was born in Paris and initially studied architecture, but on seeing an exhibition of Monet's work, he decided upon a career as an artist. He met both Monet and Seurat in 1884 and was deeply impressed with Seurat's art, his theoretical ideas, and his systematic working methods. You're looking here at an earlier work by Signac. This is entitled Bateau Pontin des Bains, and it is very impressionist in character. It strongly resembles the art of Monet, both in its broken, varied brushstrokes, in its bright coloring, in its modern subject. We see boats on the water, and judging from the title, this is presumably a bathhouse. And I bring up the title here. Bateau, meaning boats. Ponton is a variation on pont for bridge of the baths, 1885. And here another early work by Seurat. This one is titled Road to Janvière, dating from 1883. And here we see a somewhat more abstracted landscape, devoid of people, large shapes, filled with rather sketchy brushwork. The colors somewhat, I would say, schematic. For example, the shadows rendered as large areas of blue with rather little variation. But in seeing the work of Seurat, Signac was won over, and he became a faithful supporter, a vigorous promoter of Neo-Impressionism, and ultimately a theorist of it. Although Signac used the term most often divisionism to describe this style. We're looking at a work of his that dates from 1886, and we can see him adopting the more systematic, regularized brushwork of Seurat. This is called Boulevard Clichy Snow, or I should say Snow Boulevard Clichy. And you'll notice that through the snow, there are the tracks of carriages, which have been arranged in a rhythmic sequence as a kind of repetitive structural device that forms a contrast to the lines of lamps and trees and the geometrical shapes and verticals and horizontals of the buildings. Here from your textbook, is the painting Gas Holders at Clichy. It dates from 1886 as well. This work was exhibited at the last Impressionist exhibition, and it is smallish, about 2 by 2.5 feet. The subject matter is a bit surprising. This is an industrial subject, which was rare in art of the time. This is a place that, as your textbook points out, we would expect to respond to if we were there as something grimy and unpleasant and rather repellent. A repellent example of modernity, which Seurat Signac, has rendered in bright, festive colors, and made seem really quite pleasant, quite attractive. There is no human presence here, but the normal human occupants or workers at such a place are suggested by the clothing, the jackets and pants that hang over the fence there in the middle distance. You can see that he has employed the divisionist technique that originated with Seurat, but rather than points of color, there are little dabs. But it's that technique that is seen throughout the image. Formally, we've got a bunch of square and generally geometric shapes at the center, with the gas holders then on either side with their circular shapes. The circular shapes echoed in the carriage tracks in the foreground. The technique, the composition brings a sense of stability, certainly, but also calmness and order to the subject, much like Seurat's landscapes do. Signac may have sought to validate these industries and the industrial workers that were engaged here, and that make possible the comforts of life. Chu points out in the textbook that the gas holders were testimony to the heroic labor of the workers. And though they're not present, their identity is signified by the clothing on display. Signac was fairly well off financially. He owned summer houses on the Mediterranean. He loved the water and was an avid sailor. His sailboat was named the Manet Zola Wagner. So his name refers to 3 progressive, highly original creative figures of the time: Manet in painting, Zola in literature, and Wagner in music. And in the region of the Mediterranean, let's see, he depicted there, he took as subjects there a number of seascapes, a number of landscapes. And I'm showing you one work from let's see, I've got 2 works actually in some, from the Cocarnar series. I'll bring up that name you see now at the bottom. The titles are particularly interesting. This one entitled Setting Sun, Sardine Fishing, Adagio, Opus 221. So there are clear references to music. Adagio is a music tempo marking, and it means slow, essentially. Well, notice that the movement here seems to be almost non-existent. These boats are presumably anchored in this arrangement, which brings to us a kind of linear rhythmic sequence from one side of the painting to the other. And then the term Opus 221 means work 221, and this too is taken from music. It was customary for published works to be given an opus number. So Signac is suggesting that this is a kind of visual counterpart to music, and that the series as a whole might be likened to a symphony. Here is another, I'm having trouble bringing up another image here. Anyway, there were other images in the series which similarly had opus numbers, and they had different tempo markings. The one I intended to show you was labeled Allegro Maestoso. Maestoso would mean majesty or majestic, and Allegro is a faster tempo. So Signac, like many artists of the time, evince an interest in music, an attempt to borrow from music to suggest that their works have a kind of um, a harmony and a quality of particularly abstraction that is akin to music and its impact on the human mind. All right, I've got to go back here to another work that's in your textbook entitled In Times of Harmony, which dates from 1894. This is a large work, almost 10 feet by 13 feet. And its subtitle is The Golden Age is Not in the Past, It is in the Future. This work was painted for a town hall in Montreuil, France. And it's, we might call it a political pastoral. Signac was an anarchist. He believed that the government was more of a problem, a hindrance, and a help. And so he believed in no government at all, and that people might live then in a state of harmony. That human history was moving toward a time when class divisions would disappear, and people would live in greater harmony with one another. So what we're seeing here in a landscape setting are people dancing. There is painting going on in the background, boats on the water. A man is harvesting fruit from the tree. This looks like a fig tree. Here a fig is being dangled over a child, someone else reading, playing of games. And all these things coexist happily, harmoniously, next to, in company with one another. There's also harmony that exists between the landscape and the human figures. Signac wrote that his aim was justice in sociology, harmony in art, and these were the same thing. As a writer and a theorist, his most important work is the publication From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, which was completed and published in 1899. And I'm going to be sending you a brief excerpt of about 6 pages, along with about 3 questions to ponder from this publication. One other work I want to show you by him is seen here. A work that's rather fun, kind of a spoof on portraiture. The title of this is Against the Enamel of a Background, Rhythmic with Beats and Angles, Tones and Colors, Portrait of Monsieur Félix Fénéon in 1890. The work was painted in 1890, and it is about 3 feet in width. The title is comically long, and it suggests the elaborate and maybe arcane, the esoteric theories of writers like Fénéon. Remember, Fénéon is the writer, the critic that christened this art Neo-Impressionism. He was a very active participant in the critical scene in Paris in the very end of the 19th century. And one might call him a progressive or avant-garde writer. Fénéon and Charles Henry, both contemporary theorists, had tried to rationalize everything from Japanese prints to paintings by Degas. And so here, Fénéon is portrayed as a kind of magician performer with a top hat and cane and a flower in the other hand, as if he's just pulled a flower out of the hat. And behind him, visual patterns spiral outward from the center of the image. And they include an inventory of colors and decorative motifs. Um, this was intended as a kind of spoof, as a kind of a comic treatment of fainéant, and it contains a number of esoteric jokes that are largely lost to us. But for example, fainéant was often said to look like Uncle Sam, the American icon, and that may be referenced in these patterns of stripes that you see in the background, as well as the stars. He's shown here, of course, in profile, and the background forms a flat decorative surface. And so there's a conflict here between representation in the figure and the abstraction in the background that would play out in the theory and the art that would follow this moment in history over the next couple decades. Most works influenced by Seurat and Neo-Impressionism were much less adventurous than the portrait of fainéant that we just saw, and they rather adhered to more familiar imagery, such as landscape and genre scenes. And one artist that was surprisingly influenced by Neo-Impressionism was Camille Pissarro, a longtime member of the Impressionist group, the only artist that exhibited in every single Impressionist exhibition. We talked about him briefly some time ago, and I remind you he lived between 1830 and 1903. So by the mid-80s, he was 55 years of age. Now you recall that this is the time of the so-called crisis in Impressionism, when many of the original members began to have doubts about Impressionism and the Impressionist exhibitions as a viable way to show their art. Renoir especially had a crisis of sorts and went back to exhibiting at the Salon in the late 1870s. He also had a crisis in artistic style after going to Italy and seeing the works of Raphael and deciding that he could neither draw nor paint. Monet deviated from the Impressionist exhibitions, so he would exhibit again later. Pissarro was still very poor, struggling to support his family, and so he too questioned the style, and though not the exhibitions. So at about age 55, he met Seurat and Signac in the mid-1880s, at a time when he was vulnerable to influence, when he was questioning his commitment to Impressionism, and he was won over by Seurat's persuasive espousal of a scientific method based on a specific method, a definitive method based on scientific theories. And it was Pissarro who promoted the inclusion of these much younger artists, Signac and Seurat, in the 8th Impressionist exhibition. And their participation may have been one of the reasons why Monet and Renoir and others did not participate in that last exhibition. Pissarro responded to the dogmatic clarity of Seurat's ideas regarding Neo-Impressionism as a new phase in the logical advance of Impressionism, in his words. He thought of this as a scientific phase that brought clarity and order to the more romantic, his word again, approach of Monet. And so we begin to see the impact of Neo-Impressionism on him as early as 1886. This is a work entitled Apple Picking, and it was exhibited at the 8th Impressionist exhibition. Now this is a subject that Pissarro had depicted many times, but he's bringing a new technique to it. And we don't see this so much in the abstraction of shapes, but simply in the technique. And if you look at the ground down here, I'll enlarge it, you can see it's rendered in a more systematic way, in relatively even dabs of paint, not points so much, but dabs of paint. And his technique then would become, and his style would become even more formalized and systematic in later examples. This is called Picking Apples at Eragny. This is in your textbook. It dates from 1888. In this view of the same subject, there's greater formal clarity. The tree located near the center of the image, the figures scattered about so that they stand apart from one another and apart from the tree and appear as darkened shapes against the lighter landscape. The background quite simplified, and again, the paint applied in uniform dabs. And here, one other example, this entitled View from My Window, Eragny, painted in 1886. Pissarro would tire of this technique. He found it cumbersome and laborious, and so practiced only for about 5 years, and then reverted to the more free, the more sketchy impressionist technique of his earlier years. Neo-Impressionism had a particularly strong influence in Belgium, and especially so among the 20 progressive artists that made up a group called Les 20. Now you see that name written as 2 X's, which would indicate the number 20, and that's what 20 means in French, V-I-N-G-T, Les 20. So you see it written as a word or sometimes just as a number in the form of 2 X's. So the Roman numerals X for 10, 2 of them make 20. This group organized annual exhibitions from between 1886 and 1893, and in 1887, Seurat's Grand Jatte was featured just a year after it was first shown at the last Impressionist exhibition. So I'll show you just a few works by members of this group. This is by Theo van Rijsselberg, called A Girl in Green. It dates from 1892. I bring up on the bottom here his name, the title Girl in Green. So we're seeing obviously the divisionist technique applied to the subject of portraiture. And then here a work by Henri van der Velde entitled Blankenberg. This is a seaside location, painted in 1888. This view, I think, is really quite stunning in its formal abstraction. What you're seeing here, presumably, is a shadow of the fence or the wall on the right-hand side, rendered as an entirely different color and starkly set off, starkly formalized in its shape and set off from the sunlit sand of the beach beyond. Small shapes make up buildings and perhaps some figures there in the background. Another artist who was influenced by Neo-Impressionism is Van Gogh. Now, we'll talk later about Van Gogh's career and how it unfolded in time, but let me just mention now that Van Gogh came to Paris in 1886. He was there interested in and exposed to all the different styles that were being practiced, and that included Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. He noticed works by Degas and Monet and was excited about them and what he might learn from them, but also by Seurat and Signac. And so here in a work called Interior of a Restaurant, which dates from 1887, we see him trying a divisionist technique to the rendering of this interior scene. The bits of color are not they're not dots, but they're kind of dabs, and there is some variation on them. You can see here in what is presumably a tree seen through a window, longer strokes, but there is by and large uniformity in the application of paint throughout the scene. Now, in Van Gogh's case, this was something he simply tried out. He wasn't like Pizarro. He wasn't temperamentally comfortable with this. He found it laborious. He called it, by the way, stippling, but it is something that he would use periodically in his career, sometimes in combination with other techniques. And so I show you finally a work from 1889, just 2 years later. By this time, he had gone to Arles in the south of France and developed his mature style of bright colors and bold brushwork. And while in the asylum at Saint Remy, for a period of time, he said he wanted to to utilize a more systematic approach and to give more style, in his words, to the depiction of the subject of olive trees. So this work is entitled Olive Grove. It dates from 1889, and we can see the sky made up of more or less uniform dabs of color, and the same comma-like or short uh, thorn-like dabs of color are seen, although longer and a little more contrasting, are seen on the ground. There appear to be nets spread out around the olive trees, which would be there to catch the olives that then fall in the months of October and November from the trees. And we also see the shadows of the trees across the ground, but all rendered in short jab-like strokes. All right, with that, we will terminate our coverage of Neo-Impressionism, one variant of the post-Impressionist style. We'll be coming back to Van Gogh, I think, in a couple lectures from now, and talking about Seurat in the lecture in between.